Hi there. We're going to carry on with our Lenten Bible study this week by looking at a passage from Genesis 17. Last week we had looked at the reading from Genesis 9 when God makes a promise with all of creation that he will never destroy the earth again by water. And as a sign of that covenant, he puts up a very visible reminder, the rainbow that stretches across the sky. It pointed us to a God who is a God who promises life and not destruction through his Son, Jesus Christ. And by putting up such a visible reminder of that promise, it also points us to a God who we can trust when he makes promises. Last week we thought about the God that we are called into a relationship with. And this week we're going to think about ourselves, what being in a relationship with God means to us, and how it gives us a new identity. And the reason we're doing this is because the season of Lent is a season in the Christian church that brings us to the cross. It is the season before Easter. Now, in the ancient Greco-Roman world, the cross would have been a symbol of death. But because of the work that Jesus does on the cross in the Christian world, the cross is a sign of life. And so the purpose of these Bible studies and the sermons on a Sunday morning is to think about what the new life looks like that we find in a relationship with Jesus. Before we look at today's reading, I love to start my Bible studies with the same question, although a question that brings different answers every time. There's no right answer to this question. There is only your answer to this question. And so as we read this passage, is there anything that jumps out at you? Is there anything that draws your attention, that maybe surprises you? Maybe something that you didn't notice before, or something that seems unusual? Let's read this passage. Exodus 17 verses 1 to 7, and then jumping to verses 15 and 16. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers." Abram fell face down, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I have made you the father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants, and after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you." God also said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her." Did anything jump out at you? Why do you think it did? What was it making you think about? Is it challenging you to think or behave in a different way? It might be possible that God is saying something to you. And if you believe that he is, then explore that a little bit more. If you're going to be part of the Zoom conversation later, I'm going to ask the same question. So you might want to jot something down. What I'm going to do today is to look at some of the words that come up in this passage. How they are interpreted into English and how we sometimes use them today doesn't always give us a full understanding of their meaning in that passage. When we have a better understanding about the words in the passage, we have a better understanding of God and of ourselves in our relationship to God and in our relationship with God. Let's begin at verse 1. God calls himself God Almighty. That title is translated from two Hebrew words, El, which means God, and Shaddai, which means Almighty. El Shaddai. Shaddai is also sometimes translated in other parts of the Bible to mean mighty or power or great or strong. So when God calls himself El Shaddai, or when he identifies himself as El Shaddai, he is identifying himself as a mighty and powerful God. He then tells Abraham to walk before me and be blameless. In some translations, that word blameless is translated into the English word perfect. The literal translation from Hebrew would be complete or whole. It's a word that is used in other parts of the Bible. It's the word that describes Noah when God talks about the evil in the world. And there was just one man, Noah, who was blameless or perfect or complete. It's also a word that is used by Moses, or in the law that is given to Moses, the laws around sacrifice, when describing the sacrificial lamb. The sacrificial lamb must be unblemished or blameless or perfect. We might also consider the word righteous. When we think about God's instruction here to Abraham to be blameless or perfect, we cannot look at it unrelated to the bit that comes before, because God gives him another instruction first, to walk before me and be blameless. It is because of Abraham's choice to walk with God or walk before God that he is able to be blameless. Paul writes to the Roman church that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. And as was pointed out to me yesterday, the Apostle James says something similar. He says that Abraham was considered righteous for what he did. What he did was to put his trust in God and to live out that trust in the things that he did. When God tells Abraham to be blameless, he is able to be that way because he also walks before God faithfully. And it's the same with us. Our righteousness doesn't come from anything that we do ourselves. We are righteous because we put our faith in Jesus. Before I move on to the meaning of the different names, there is another word that I want to highlight. In verse 4, when God tells Abram that he will have a new name, he tells him that he will become the father of many nations. That word nation, or goy, in the original Hebrew, is translated into the word nation 375 times in the King James Version of the Bible. But interestingly, it's also translated 173 times to mean either pagan or Gentile. Although Abraham will become genealogically the father of the nation of Israel through his son Isaac and his grandson Jacob, he will also be the father of more than just his genealogical nation. Right at the start of God's relationship with the people of Israel, God is already indicating that his covenant to be your God and the God of your descendants after you will stretch beyond just the nation of Israel, but will also include the Gentiles. And we see that come to fruition when Paul heads out into the Greco-Roman world, across the Roman Empire, and takes the gospel to the Gentiles. In fact, it starts even before that, when Peter visits Cornelius, the Roman soldier, and converts him into the Christian faith. Let's have a look at the names and the name changes that happen in this passage. We start with Abram. Abram means exalted father. This is the name Abram would have been given by his parents when he was born. Something that perhaps we've lost in our Western culture that we still find in many other cultures around the world is the importance that is attached to the names that are given to children. We chose the names of our children because we liked the sound of them. We thought that they were lovely names. Their second names were chosen because of family connections. But in some cultures, like the ancient Hebrew culture, names are given that tell the story of some sort. It might be the story that describes the character of the baby. It might be a story that describes the circumstances of the child's birth. It might be a story that tells of the hope of the life that lies ahead. For example, the name Tandi means hope. A child born into a particular culture might be given that name because whatever the circumstances might have been around the time of the child's birth, the birth of this child might have brought hope into that situation. Or a child might be given the name Sumana, because in the days after the birth of the child, they were one of those children who slept through the night, who didn't cause much bother or fuss. And so they were given the name Sumana, which means good-natured. Abram's parents probably called him Abram because their hope was that he would become an exalted father one day, that he would bear many sons, and they would be able to continue the family line and build up the family wealth. Sadly, at the age of 99, Abram had still not become the father that his parents had hoped him to be, and probably lost hope of ever becoming a father before God promised him otherwise. By changing their names, what God is doing is speaking into their lives, giving them a new identity and a new sense of purpose. Abram is no longer just an exalted father, which he had not yet become. Now he will be called Abraham, which means the father of a multitude. By putting his trust in God, by choosing to walk before God faithfully, his life takes a new direction, a new purpose. Although still the same purpose, although still the same person, he now has a new identity and a new purpose. We also see that in his wife. Sarai is a name that means princess. But in the subtlest of changes, Sarai becomes Sarah, which means noble woman. I thought about this quite a bit. Why the subtle change? Why the change from princess to noble woman? This is what I concluded. A princess is only a princess because of other people. Her identity is determined either by whom she marries or by who her parents are. Princess Beatrice is only a princess because her father is Prince Andrew. Princess Diana only became a princess when she married Prince Charles. When God gives her a new name and a new identity, he is saying to Sarah that your worthiness, your value as a person, is no longer dependent on other people. Your value comes from who you are. And if we think about the story of Abraham and Sarah, and how Sarah hears of God's promise to Abraham and cannot believe that it could possibly be fulfilled through her, and so she instructs Abraham to have a child with her slave, Hagar, then we can see how Sarai never saw herself as being worthy of God's plans or of being a part of God's plans. But God corrects her. He gives her a new identity, and in that new identity, he gives her a new purpose. You are worthy of my promises for who you are. You are worthy of fulfilling my promises. And so eventually she gives birth to her son Isaac, who becomes the father of Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel and becomes the father of 12 sons who will go on to be the root of the 12 tribes of Israel. Sarah is worthy and has value for who she is, not because of anybody else. Being in a relationship with God means that we have a new identity. Paul says that we are a new creation. God doesn't always give us a new name, although historically when people converted to Christianity, they took on a new name, hence the phrase Christian name. But God does give us a new purpose. And that's something that we're going to think about in the sermon on Sunday. We're going to end the Bible study there for this week. I'm going to leave you with some questions to think about. And if you join us on Zoom later this evening, these are the things that we're going to chat about. But for now, may I say thank you for joining with us this week, and I look forward to sharing with you next week as we think about the freedom that we find within the boundaries that God sets for us. God bless, take care, and goodbye. The first question I asked was this. As we read through this passage, was there anything that jumped out at you? Anything that you didn't notice before? Or maybe something that seems unusual? God tells Abraham to walk before me. What do you think it means to walk before God? Abraham chooses to trust God with what might seem impossible. Have you ever found yourself in a situation like that, trusting God with what might seem impossible? What does it teach us about a life of faithfulness? And finally, as the story unfolds, we find that it takes place across many decades. Perhaps we have had the same experiences, where God just seems to move at a very slow pace. What is it teaching us about dependence on God?